Hello there, I'm James and welcome back to Block 42. Today I'm going to be showing you an animation tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be learning how to make a rocket ship fly. I'm going to be showing you what I do as well as why I do it. So let's begin. So to start, I've got a scene here with three main elements. We have the rocket pad itself, the rocket, which is going to be the star of the show, as well as the rocket. Underneath it, very small, I'm just lifting up the rocket to show you now, we also have some fire, just making it larger. So what I've done is this fire, which is going to be the exhaust from the rocket, I've made very, very small using the scaling tool and put it underneath the rocket just to hide it to begin with. So I'm going to extend the time frame because we're going to need about 150 frames here. And I'm going to give it a bit of a leeway, about 15-20 frames of leeway before anything happens. And right at the end, we're going to push the rocket way up into the air. This is going to make the rocket lift off into the air. However, if we play it, it looks pretty boring. It's just going up at a constant rate, and we don't really want that. So I've created some graphs here to show you what I'm going to do, with time running along the bottom axis and speed going up the side. I've added the keyframes that we currently have and drawn a line between them. As you can see, it's very flat and kind of boring. We don't want that. So here is the curve that I actually want, with the rocket starting out slow and gradually getting faster. And here I've removed the line to show you these are the keyframes that we'll probably need to add to make that happen. So if we go back to our animation here, what you're going to see me doing is I'm looking in between these 2 points, like the two furthest keyframes, and I'm dragging the rocket down, creating another keyframe, and showing, as you can see here, that means that the rocket will start out slow and then get faster. Right now, as it is, it's kind of jerky, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add more keyframes in between all the other ones. This will have the effect of smoothing out this transition into that curve that we saw earlier. So I've sped this up here because this is a very sort of slow, tedious process. But what you can see I'm doing is I'm just gradually looking through, scrubbing through the animation. I'm seeing if there's any points that are too jerky and seeing is there a way of making that more smooth. In order to smooth out the motion, all you need to do is add extra keyframes in between other keyframes and smooth out the motion, just by moving the rocket up and down slightly so that it starts out slow and gets faster. These types of frames are actually called in-betweens in the animation industry, because they are in between other frames. So I've slowed things down here to show you that I've got a result that I'm pretty happy with. The rocket is rising, and it looks like it's rising in a fairly slow, stable manner. So now we're going to move on to something else. So this liftoff motion is good, but it's still a little bit boring, a little bit stale. It doesn't have the dynamic quality of a realistic rocket launch, that power of the rocket engines. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the rocket, and every couple of frames, I'm just going to nudge it side to side very slightly. Also notice I'm doing this before the rocket is lifted off. This is to give the liftoff itself a sense of power and anticipation. I'm just nudging it very, very slightly every couple of frames to give the idea of a vibration going on in the rocket. And I'm just slowing it down here so you can have a look at what it looks like. Nice little shimmy there on the launch pad. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do that same thing, give the rocket a little nudge every other sort of frame or so, and continue this vibration as the rocket lifts off. Because it doesn't stop as soon as the rocket lifts off, we're going to make it vibrate throughout its launch. See, what I'm doing here though is I'm now skipping a couple extra frames per offset. We were doing it every other frame, every 2 frames, now we're doing it every 3 frames, and soon we're going to be doing it every 4 frames, and so on, making the gap bigger and bigger, because as the rocket lifts off and gets faster and faster, the vibrations are going to be less obvious. And so here, just slow it down again, this is the final product. It's good, it's a little bit subtle, but it gives us the idea of the power that the rocket is undergoing and what the forces involved are like, and just adds a little bit of dynamic life to the project. So now we're going to work on the exhaust flame. So While we've been doing this, the rocket's just been flying up, there hasn't been anything really pushing it. So now, let's change that. So for this, we're going to be using the fire under the rocket, there, and we're going to be using the scaling function to animate this rather than the moving function. So, as the rocket lifts off, we're going to expand this flame here, and we're going to do that before the rocket properly lifts off, just about the same time it starts to vibrate, because that's when the rocket will start to push. So I'm just fiddling with the timing here very slightly as to when the rocket comes out. It's going to come out just slightly after the rocket starts to vibrate. Just offset that action a little bit. And now what we're going to do is we're going to animate the scale in the Y direction, which is always up and down, to give the idea of a flickering flame. So right now it's fairly sort of static, it's a nice long flame, it looks good. But what we're going to do here is that this flame, we are going to animate it. So we're going to make it longer and shorter every couple of frames to give it the idea of a dynamic flame that is flickering, that has life and activity to it. And here what I'm doing is I'm speeding this up quite significantly because this is just a case of essentially eyeballing the motion. So I'm going through, I'm seeing what the motion looks like. Does this look good? Does this look bad? I'm fiddling with it every now and again. And at this point I'm adding a bunch of keyframes, just sort of, you know, making it quite a dynamic flame. Plenty of keyframes all over the place. And now we're going to see what it looks like. Lovely stuff. And then, just like the vibrations, we're going to trail off the intensity and the frequency of these movements as the rocket gets into the air, just to give the early stages a little bit more violence and the later stages a little bit less. And so now, smoke, because you can't have fire without smoke. This will be another dynamic element that we're adding to the scene, and I've scaled it very small again, so it's essentially invisible, hidden there in the base of the rocket launch. And as the rocket starts to vibrate, and as the fire comes out, we're going to create this big plume of smoke at its base, because rocket fire causes lots of smoke. So what I'm doing here is I'm keyframing the smoke to give it some extra dynamic action, because if it just expands and stays still, that looks very weird, because smoke doesn't behave like that. So what I'm doing is, as the rocket launches, it's going to expand and contract, give it some dynamic life, and then as the rocket gets higher and higher, we're going to shrink it down until it disappears. And now we're slowing things down again, just to see the final product. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So there you have it. That's how you animate a fairly realistic looking rocket launch. But what if you're not going for realism? Now what I'm going to show you is how to create a more cartoony rocket launch. This is a style that works really well in an exaggerated, cartoony type of animation. And what I've got here is the same setup as we had last time, but I've gone through and I've deleted all the keyframes. Almost all the keyframes. I've deleted all the keyframes, so nothing now is animated. It's just a static image. We've got the rocket, we've got the smoke, and we've got the fire, just all hidden. So what I'm doing here is I'm just lifting the rocket off very simply, like we did at first last time, so it just goes into the air in a single moment, but that's fine, that's what we want. I want this to be quite a sudden, bouncy movement, so this sort of motion is fine. This isn't as realistic as it would otherwise be, but that's the idea. So what we're going to use here is a technique known as squash and stretch to give a very cartoony, exaggerated appearance to this animation. So what I'm doing is I'm shrinking the rocket down and making it wider. That's the squash. And then, when it's in the air, I'm going to lengthen it and make it narrower. That's the stretch. Doing this is a technique that makes the animation a lot more stylistic and a lot more bouncy, so it looks like it's bouncing down into the ground before lifting off into the air like you might push a rubber ball. Obviously rockets don't behave like this, but this is a form of the cartoony nature of this particular animation. It gives a bit more life, a bit more presence, and a little bit more fun. So now we're moving on to the fire underneath the rocket again. This is going to be a lot simpler of an animation. I'm not going to be fiddling around with too many keyframes this time because the motion is so quick, we're not going to be seeing the flame particularly often. So the flame just sort of growing and then getting a bit longer, that should do. Moving on to the smoke, same thing again. It's going to be a simpler, bouncy emotion because the entire animation is a lot shorter. And so it's just going to be a simple push out and pull in of the smoke. Let's see what that looks like. So as you can see, this is a very different style of animation to the one we did before. It's quicker, it's simpler in a sense, but it also gives a lot more presence. It feels like the rocket is alive, it's anticipating launching into space. And there you have it. These have just been some tips and tricks for animating a rocket launch, both a realistic version and a cartoony version. You can take these tips and tricks to further animations and use the same principles to create interesting, dynamic animations. We hope you've enjoyed watching this tutorial, and it gives you some ideas for other future interesting animations that you might want to try out. Why not try downloading Block 42 and trying these things out for yourself? Good luck and have fun!